My Lord and my God, I firmly believe that you are here, that you see me, that you hear me. I adore you with profound reverence. I ask you for pardon of my sins and grace to make this time of prayer fruitful. My Mother Immaculate, Saint Joseph, my Father and Lord, my guardian angel, intercede for me. Well, many of us are several days now into self-isolation or quarantine, and perhaps we began pretty well with a good timetable, maybe building in prayer there every day with the 10 minutes with Jesus. But if we are self-isolating with other people or quarantining with other people, perhaps by now we are realizing the truth of something that Mark Twain, the famous novelist of the 19th century, said: "Nothing so needs reforming as other people's habits." Look at the way that my wife keeps repeating those silly jokes. Or I hadn't noticed until now how lazy my brother is. Or I know exactly what is going through my silly husband's mind at this moment. They're the kind of things that Mark Twain is referring to, these habits of other people that we are convinced need reforming more than anything else in the world. And this tends to be a realization or a kind of conviction that grows on us after a couple of days of isolation with other people. We begin to notice their defects, or at least imagine that we are noticing their defects very well. We think we know them inside out. Now, if we look at today's Gospel from St. John, we see the very same thing happens to Jesus. In other words, Jesus, you are a victim of the exact same mindset. Because we're told by St. John that as the Jewish Feast of Tabernacles drew near, after his brothers had left for the festival, he went up as well, but quite privately, without drawing attention to himself. Meanwhile, some of the people of Jerusalem were saying, "Isn't this the man they want to kill? And here he is, speaking freely, and they have nothing to say to him. Can it be true the authorities have made up their minds that he is the Christ? Yet we all know where he comes from, but when the Christ appears, no one will know where he comes from." So let's see these people here with their judgments. They're making these judgments about Jesus. And the Gospel actually is a lot about something that's called murmuring. A lot of people who are very quick with their opinions and their judgments about Jesus. 99% of them wrong, of course. And it's no different in this case. They are convinced that they know that Jesus comes from Nazareth, that he was born there, and that therefore he couldn't be the Messiah because the Messiah has to be born in Bethlehem. Well, in fact, they don't know. As Jesus himself says in the Gospel a little later on, when Jesus is in the temple, you, Lord, cry out, "Yes, you know me, and you know where I came from." Well, I think Jesus is being ironic. He's referring to all their kind of murmurings and their conviction that they know Jesus inside out. And he's saying, really, you don't know me at all. And you don't know where I come from. Because, of course, Jesus is from Bethlehem. Now we could ask Jesus to help us these days, these several days into maybe extra isolation with people, not to fall into that trap. Not to fall into the trap of thinking, well, I know people inside out, the people that I'm living with. Now, there are two very important things here. And the first one is the IYSIYGI principle. In Latin, the Latin translation of that principle is quid recipiter ad modum recipientis recipiter. Or, another way of putting it is, for the thief, everyone is a thief. The Latin means that a person receives or something receives according to the mode or the nature of the recipient. So for the thief, because he's a thief, everybody he sees, he thinks they are thieves also. And the IYSIYGI principle is, if you spot it, you got it. So in other words, if you begin to think that this person is very lazy, or that person is really unfriendly, or that person is very haughty and proud, is not for certain, but there's a high probability that you are looking in the mirror. In that person is mirroring your own defects. Or in other words, we are very receptive to that person's apparent haughtiness or vanity or laziness, whatever, because in fact it is just echoing something that is part of our nature. So that's the very first thing. So we have to be on our guard when we do notice things. And again, we have to ask you, Lord, especially these days of extra isolation with people, that we would be humble, and that when we start noticing these things about people, that the first question we would ask ourselves is, am I actually looking in the mirror? When I notice these defects, so to speak, am I looking in the mirror? So that's the first thing. That's our principle. The second thing is coming from St. Josemaria, a great point he has in the way. I'm going to read it and then give an example from his own life, which I think is very representative, really, of the way he lived his life. And this is what he says. Charity does not consist so much in giving as in understanding. Therefore, seek an excuse for your neighbour. There is always one to be found, if it is your duty to judge. So, charity, which we often think of as giving things, he says, well, actually, charity is really primarily understanding people, understanding why they might be saying that or doing that or acting that way. In other words, finding excuses for people, because, as he says, there's always one to be found. Let us these days promise our Lord that we will try to look for excuses for people, for those that are living with us. And let's hope that they in their turn find excuses for us and our behaviour. And anyway, here's the example from St. Josemaria, which is very nice. It is told by one of the young vocations to Opus Dei that lived very close quarters with St. Josemaria in the 1930s in Madrid. They were very poor, and very often they didn't have money for the basic necessities. They were very short of food even. And they were stuck they were a bit like many of us are now, kind of very much piled up on top of each other, living in close quarters. And in those situations where, people's tempers can get frayed, people can be on edge because, they don't have enough to eat, or there's tedium and so on. And it's one of those kind of situations. And as Pedro Casiero recalls that at that time there was a young fellow, a boy, that they used to invite around to that centre for breakfast. And there they would have for breakfast, as a special treat, chocolate con churros. Now, churros are those little dough sticks, which I think they only really exist in Spain, but they eat them with hot chocolate. They're very nice, I would say, very fattening. So it's chocolate con churros. And so this fellow, what he says, this is the way Pedro Casiero says it. He says, when he had gone, we complained to the father, St. Josemaria, that this guest had really a good appetite, for he had guzzled several cups of hot chocolate one after another, and several lots of churros. The father charitably and cheerfully made an excuse for him, as he always did. The problem, he said, was that the boy had not managed to get his calculations right. He had finished a churro when he had still some hot chocolate left, and the hot chocolate was down when he still had some churros left. That comment is an excellent example of the warmth of his charity. He always knew how to put a sympathetic slant on any comment which might be, or seemed to be, critical, even though it was only meant as a joke, or referred to something quite unimportant, as in this case. So it's a great example of the kind of charity that it would be great for us to be living with one another these days. Let's ask Our Lady for the capacity to be far more understanding and forgiving with those with whom we find ourselves perhaps confined in these days. I give you thanks, my God, for the good resolutions affections and inspirations you have communicated to me in this meditation, I ask you for help to put them into effect. My Mother Immaculate, Saint Joseph, my Father and Lord, my guardian angel, intercede for me.